Alright guys, we are going to be reacting to the German East Africa campaign during World War I and Masterclass in Guerrilla Warfare. Let's jump in.
I recently told the story about the events that inspired the epic film, The African Queen. The events in question occurred in East Africa during the First World War, and many of you have got in touch saying that you knew little or even nothing about this campaign. So today, by popular demand, I'm going to explore this fascinating and largely forgotten conflict in a little more detail. Far from the mud of the Western Front, a war was fought across the plains and jungles of East Africa, in which Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, leading a small German colonial army, held out against an Allied army nearly 10 times his size for the entire war. Undefeated, he surrendered 2 weeks after the armistice in Europe. This is the story of that war, against a man nicknamed the Lion of Africa. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, Germany's colonial empire around the world immediately came under pressure. Her various Pacific islands and Chinese port swiftly fell to the Australians, New Zealanders and the Japanese. In Africa too, Togoland was swiftly overrun, and whilst it took a little longer, Southwest Africa and Cameroon were neutralised. There was just one colony left, German East Africa. And here the Allies, British, Indians, South Africans, Rhodesians, Nigerians and more, were up against one of the greatest guerrilla leaders in military history, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. Aged 44 when the war broke out, von Lettow-Vorbeck had been commissioned in the German army in 1890, where he saw active service in China during the Boxer Rebellion and in Southwest Africa. In early 1914, he was appointed commander of the Schutztruppe, or protection force, in German East Africa, consisting of about 2,500 askaris, which are black African troops, and 200 white officers. When the First World War broke out a few months later, he found himself surrounded by enemies on all sides. The British Royal Navy out at sea, and British troops to the north in Kenya, and to the southwest in northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, modern-day Zambia and Malawi. To the west, across the Great Lakes, lay the Belgians in the Congo, and down on the southern frontier, the Portuguese in Mozambique. Lieutenant Colonel von Lettow-Vorbeck prepared for the inevitable Allied, aka British, invasion. For the British, the need to knock the colony out of the war became more important when the German cruiser, Königsberg, had sunk HMS Pegasus in Zanzibar harbour. The Königsberg then took refuge in the delta of the Rufiji River in German East Africa, where she evaded Allied forces for nearly a year before finally being cornered and sunk. The hunt for the Königsberg was the inspiration behind Wilbur Smith's book, also made into a film, Shout at the Devil. The sinking of the cruiser actually proved a bonus for von Lettow-Vorbeck. Even before the cruiser's demise, some of her crew had been seconded to a flotilla of little boats that had given the Germans control of Lake Tanganyika, before their defeat in a bizarre engagement with the Royal Navy. That battle for Lake Tanganyika proved the inspiration for the book and then the film, The African Queen. With the sinking of the Königsberg, the ship's crew and her guns now joined von Lettow-Vorbeck's army. By then, that army had already proved more than a match for the Allies. On the 2nd of November 1914, 2 brigades of British and Indian troops landed at the port of Tanga in the north of the colony. The landings turned into a humiliating disaster, which included being attacked by a swarm of angry bees. Despite being outnumbered 8 to 1, the Germans drove the British and Indians back to their beachhead, where they re-embarked just 3 days after landing. The expeditionary force had lost just over 10% of their strength, 800 men, killed, wounded or missing. They left behind 16 machine guns, hundreds of rifles and 600,000 rounds of ammunition. That windfall would sustain the Germans for the next year.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot of ammunition. A lot of it.
In January 1915, they notched up another victory when they defeated 4 Indian brigades at Jassin. The Indian commander, Lieutenant Colonel Rugbir Singh Pathania, was killed and over 300 of his men captured. That victory had, however, cost von Lettow-Vorbeck dearly. The Germans had sustained 300 casualties, including 7 officers and 8 NCOs killed, and had used up over 200,000 rounds of ammunition.
Wow.
Whilst his men were crowing at yet another drubbing for the Allies, von Lettow-Vorbeck was more sanguine. He recognised that fighting pitched battles like the one at Jasin was not sustainable with his limited numbers.
Yeah, because of the supply. Yeah, it's true. And of course, man, you can sustain this for a certain amount of time, but at some point, you're gonna run out of resources and man.
Supplies. From now on, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck decided to fight a mobile guerrilla war against the Allies. He would use the very size of East Africa to keep one step ahead of his enemies. And it was one heck of a size. At over 340,000 square miles, the colony of German East Africa was bigger than France and Germany combined. Over 300,000 Allied troops would eventually fight in German East Africa, and at their peak there were 150,000 British Imperial troops chasing his small German army, and they were joined by 20,000 Portuguese and 15,000 Belgian troops. That was a massive diversion of manpower from the European theatre of war. In March 1916, South African General Jan Smuts was placed in charge of the underperforming British campaign. He was bolstered by 2 South African divisions, along with units from both southern and northern Rhodesia. And along with the existing British and Indian troops, Smuts also had contingents from the King's Africa Rifles and locally recruited African units under his command. It was an eclectic army for the former Boer general to take on the Germans, and it would be further augmented by black troops from the West Africa and the Caribbean as the campaign progressed. One of the most unusual components was the 25th Battalion Royal Fusiliers, possibly one of the most colourful and courageous units to take to the field in this campaign. Drawn from the Legion of Frontiersmen, which had been formed over 10
years. I cannot imagine the level of, of hotness during those times, man. Even looking at these pictures, I'm like, I'm already sweating. Yeah, Africa's very hot. It's extremely hot. And it's not a humid hot, it's a dry hot. Like you're cooking yourself.
Years previously, the 25th's ranks included big game hunters, Boer War veterans, cowboys, Canadian Mounties, aristocrats, gold prospectors, prize fighters, and even circus performers. All these people had trained, lived or travelled in wild countries around the world, and many were considerably older than the norm. For instance, veteran big game hunter turned conservationist, 63-year-old Frederick Selous. And whilst the 25th also consisted of youngsters drawn from desk jobs and factories in Britain, they would gain the nickname, the Old and the Bold. Smuts planned an offensive from 4 directions to trap von Lettow-Vorbeck in the interior of the colony. The British Imperial forces would advance from Kenya and northern Rhodesia, the Belgians would come eastwards from the Congo, and the Portuguese troops would move north from their colony in Mozambique. Von Lettow-Vorbeck was forced on the defensive, destroying railway tracks, crops, and anything else he considered of value, as Smuts pushed him back into an ever-decreasing area. Contained in the interior of East Africa, with dwindling supplies and manpower, it was only a matter of time before the Germans waved a white flag. Confident of a job well done, Smuts took up a post on the Imperial War Cabinet in London, leaving the mopping up operation to fellow South African General Jacob van der Venter.
Dang, what a name.
But Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck had no intention of surrendering. With his reasonably small numbers and an ability to live off the land, and using captured arms and ammunition, he believed he could hold out indefinitely. And that is exactly what he set out to do. Dividing what remained of his army into 3, they tried to break through the tightening net. Whilst one of the columns found themselves surrounded and 5,000 did surrender, the other 2 German armies, including one led by their commander, broke free. The war now descended into a game of deadly chase through the African terrain, which was nothing like the mud of Flanders fields. The landscape was perfect for defensive warfare and the guerrilla hit-and-run tactics that von Lettow-Vorbeck now conducted. But apart from the Germans, it also became a war against nature.
I told you.
Advancing troops had to cut their way through dense vegetation, cross countless rivers and streams, wade through swamps, scale mountain ranges, whilst constantly on the lookout for lions, snakes, elephants, and angry hippos.
Yeah, at that point, it's over. It's over. I mean, not only you have to worry about your enemies, but you have to worry about the animals. Well, they will eat you, especially during at night. Lions, oof. Oh, yeah.
And then there were tropical diseases.
Yep.
Malaria, dysentery and pneumonia would account for 10 British Empire soldiers for every one killed by the Germans. The 9th South African Infantry, who had a strength of just over 1,100 men in February 1916, were in the space of 8 months reduced to 116 fully fit men. And that without almost any contact with the enemy.
Wow.
One such casualty was South African private Jan Morkel. Jackie, as he was known, had played for the Springboks in their historic tour of the British Isles and France in 1912-1913. He scored 4 tries and kicked 2 conversions as the Boks won all 5 matches, the first South African side to win the Grand Slam of rugby matches, defeating all 4 home nations, that's England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, plus the French.
Wow.
When the war started, Jan Morkel enlisted in the 1st Mounted Brigade and proceeded to East Africa. He died of dysentery in May 1916 and is buried in the war cemetery at Dar es Salaam.
Damn.
Close by lies another member of that victorious Springbok team. Gerald Tommy Thompson of the 5th Regiment South African Infantry was killed in action just a few weeks after his teammate's death.
Wow.
In November 1917, von Lettow-Vorbeck once more broke out and this time crossed into Mozambique. For the next 10 months, the same old game of chase was now played out in the northern reaches of the Portuguese colony, before von Lettow-Vorbeck retraced his steps and crossed back into German East Africa in September 1918. A contingent of King's Africa Rifles were taken by boat up Lake Nyassa to cut off his advance. So it was now time for him to catch his pursuers off guard again. He suddenly veered west and crossed into British-controlled northern Rhodesia, capturing the town of Kasama on the 9th of November. Just 2 days later, in France, the armistice ending the First World War was signed. But that news took its time to reach the African bush. A brief engagement was fought just outside Kasama the day after the armistice.
Wow.
And then 2 days later, local forces held off a German attack on a rubber factory. Finally, on the 16th of November, a British magistrate, under a flag of truce, arrived at von Lettow-Vorbeck's HQ to bring the news that the war was over. On the 25th of November 1918, the German commander surrendered his force of 170 Germans, 1,300 askari and 3,000 porters at the town of Abercorn.
Wow.
It was 2 weeks since the guns had fallen silent on the Western Front. After 4 years, although vastly outnumbered, he remained undefeated.
They didn't defeat him.
He was
in theory, they didn't defeat him. They didn't. That's crazy. Especially German in Africa. Ooh, different terrain, different climate. I don't even think there's well, if you can acclimate to the weather, you know, you can make something happen. But Africa is not an easy place to just, you know, go around and have warfare. It's not easy.
So, the only German commander to successfully invade part of the British Empire, northern Rhodesia. It was an impressive military feat. Even more impressive because his askari troops had not received a cash payment for 2 years. The war in East Africa was not simply a British war. Whilst the British were present, including the loyal North Lancashires and the old and the bold, their army also consisted of Indians, South Africans and troops from both northern and southern Rhodesia. Black troops serving in the King's Africa Rifles came from Kenya, Uganda and Nyasaland, whilst the West African Frontier Force from Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, and Gambia, and the Nigerian Regiment, along with the 2nd West Indies Regiment, also served in the campaign. And when you include the Belgians and the Portuguese, Generals Smuts and Van der Venter very much commanded an international effort. That effort had cost the Allies dear. The British Imperial Army had lost 11,000 dead, mainly from disease, and a similar number hospitalised. And against that, German forces had lost an estimated 2,000 men. But then when you add the 95,000 Allied porters who died, and the huge numbers of men hospitalised, again from tropical diseases, the overall Allied casualty figures reached something like 300,000.
Yeah, that was not even
But the human cost of this campaign went further. It's been estimated that as the war and scorched earth policies, principally by the Germans, consumed East Africa, possibly up to 365,000 civilians also died.
Wow.
Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck returned to Germany a hero. His small band of German officers and NCOs paraded through the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. A staunch opponent of Hitler, He died aged 93 in
Oh.
Hamburg in 1964. In the very year that he died, the West German government agreed to reimburse the askari troops their back pay from World War I.
Wow.
300 elderly Africans turned up on the shores of Lake Victoria claiming to be veterans. Few had any paperwork, whilst a handful presented fragments of uniform. To prove that they were indeed askari and not people chancing their arm, each was presented with a broom and instructed to carry out the Imperial Army's manual of arms.
Oh.
Not a single man failed the test. With men like that, no wonder the Lion of Africa had been able to keep the Allies at bay. Well, I hope you enjoyed that.
Very good. A little bit too much romanticized, I will say. He was romanticizing the event a little bit too much for my taste. But hey, man, I'm telling you, this is why the Prussian army style, the Prussian style of army or military culture is very strong. You can throw that to the Africans, they'll take advantage of it. That's what they did. The Prussian style, right? I think it was Prussian. At that time, it was Prussian, still Prussian. Very interesting. I have no idea. I'm very ignorant when it comes down to Germany and Africa. I think we reacted to a couple videos regarding the topic, but beside the point. I didn't know that Germany, empire, the German empire used to be outside of Europe with a bunch of colonies. I didn't know that. I did not know that. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below, guys. Like always, I'll see you next one.